Okay, so we are in chapter 4 now, ages 18 through 20. So, first half of college. I chose to attend Franciscan University over other secular universities because, one, I got in, and two, because I wanted to have philosophy professors who were serious Catholics, so I could trust that they were on the right philosophical track. I really wanted my professors to have God, i.e. the truth, on their side. I also was going to predict that if I went to any other college, they weren't going to be Catholic, and then I wouldn't really hear the best arguments for Catholicism. And, another part of me knew that if I were to ever hear new arguments against Catholicism, I would be able to hear their intelligent and informed responses. I also wanted to have the opportunity to talk with them about my own questions and ideas in my ongoing effort to gain a further understanding of my faith. I also thought that if worse came to worse and I lost my faith, I would at least know that I had given it the best chance I possibly could. Unlike the atmosphere of Colby, which had a more traditional Catholic feel to it, Franciscan University was all about praise and worship, raising your hands to the Lord and speaking in tongues, kind of like that Club Max from Colby. I did not like that aspect of it at all, and I considered many of the Catholics there more emotionally driven to their faith rather than intellectually. Also at this school, the dorms were separated by gender, and they had extremely strict male-female visiting hours. 5 hours a day on Saturday and Sunday, with an open-door policy. That was the only way a girl could be in a guy's room and vice versa. You could get written up and fined for simply making out with somebody on a couch or bench, or even just using a bad word. This is college, not high school, not grade school. Also, the school-wide internet had every pornographic site blocked, which wasn't bad for me because I had never looked at porn, nor was I planning to, since it was a mortal sin to do so. Despite all of these restrictions, the overall atmosphere of the campus was very pleasant in a way that reminded me of my more innocent homeschooler days. A lot of the people attending were also former homeschoolers. Thankfully, not everyone there was all about praise and worship, especially the philosophy professors. The philosophy professors in their classes turned out to be exactly what I wanted, and they were excellent. In my first semester, I learned a lot of very important things. The first thing I learned had to do with prayer and its efficacy. I learned that prayer itself did not and could not actually change God's will because God's will was perfect and immutable. God also already knew what we would ask before we asked it, and he knew why we were asking it better than we did. The function of prayer was to actually align our wills closer to God's will. God doesn't need to be told what we want or what we need. Unlike God, humans were often mistaken about what they wanted. I already strongly suspected most of this, but it was nice to know that I could believe it and still be Catholic. This understanding rendered every atheistic criticism of prayer moot. I also took metaphysics my first semester, where I learned the ontological proof of God and the contingency argument for God. The ontological proof of God was, in retrospect, just a proof by definition, but it was very compelling. There's a whole YouTube series about it, especially like from Alex O'Connor. It's definitely interesting. The contingency argument for God was basically a refined version of the cosmological argument that I learned in high school that better explained how we know about God's absolute qualities. And it also dodged the whole gods of the gaps fallacy much better than the cosmological argument did. I also learned a few important limits to philosophy and what proofs of God were legitimate and which ones were not. All of those atheists who required evidence to believe in God didn't even really know what they were asking, since evidence proper could only indicate things about the physical realm, and God was spiritual. God's existence can never be perceived by the five senses or measured with an instrument. We could only know about God through pure logic and reason alone, not through evidence. It was this semester that I watched Monty Python's The Meaning of Life for the first time. It made me sick to my stomach, and I could not finish it. Obviously, I could laugh at it now, but for who I was at the time, it just was like nails on a chalkboard. One of the first songs in the movie was called Every Sperm is Sacred, and it mocked the Catholic Church's teachings on contraception. I was upset because I thought they were mischaracterizing the church's teaching to make it sound more absurd than it really was, and at the time I really believed the consequences of this were dire. I would later find out that the church's teaching was exactly as absurd as they portrayed it. I also saw and enjoyed The Exorcism of Emily Rose, which was the most realistic exorcism movie I ever saw. It really hit home for me because the setting of the story was very similar to the college dorm I was living in, and since it was based on a true story, I really got the scariest experience out of it. The whole point of Emily deciding to let the devil possess her and ruin her life was to serve as proof that the devil was real and therefore God was real. In many ways, she could be considered a Catholic saint. At least that's how the movie portrayed it. My roommate in college wanted me to join a household, which was the Catholic equivalent of a fraternity, at least at this school. And since he didn't like any of the households that were already established there, he started his own. I helped him even though I was not super interested or invested. We ended up calling it the Warriors of Light, and our focus was on guardian angels and chivalry towards women. Big sausage fest with a bunch of nerds. We would pray the rosary every week, go to Eucharistic adoration for 1 hour every week, and every Saturday we would have a Lord's Day meal where we would read from the Bible and discuss the passage that we read together. Despite my faith still being very firm, I immediately ran into some problems with my new girlfriend that I met there. I had always assumed that as long as I dated a practicing Catholic girl, I would not run into any chastity problems. But I was wrong. The problems were not the typical temptations of lust. Rather, they were my questions of specific moral do's and don'ts. For example, were the very minor things like kissing on the lips really a mortal sin before marriage? At what point exactly does kissing become a sin, if at all? What about rubbing her back? Sure, I learned that many of these things could be mortal sins if they caused arousal, but were any of them actually declared to be a mortal sin by a pope speaking infallibly ex cathedra? What does it say in the actual catechism? There was no way that any action leading to arousal could be a mortal sin, because if that were true, then it would be a mortal sin for me to just sit next to her. I needed to make sure I was not sinning, because not only was my soul at stake, but so was the soul of the person I claimed to love. It would not be a loving thing for me to put her soul in danger of hell just for a bit of fun on earth. So I got an actual copy of the actual catechism of the Catholic Church, not the abridged versions that I learned from prior. And I read the fine print on chastity, hoping to get some specific answers. Unfortunately, it was just as vague and problematic as the advice had been given in the past. The Church's main gripe against sexual sins, according to this catechism, was that it didn't show respect for the other person, it used the other person as a means instead of an end, and it was not an honest expression of love before marriage. All of these reasons really bothered me because in my situation, from my perspective, I did respect her. She was actually more hurt by my refusal to give in to the temptation. And making out with her would not be using her either, even if I was aroused, because it was not against her will. Consenting adults. Plus, there's a big difference between kissing a stranger and kissing a romantic partner that you really like and are exclusive with. And especially in the modern age, people will be like, well, who cares if you're exclusive or not, or if they're a stranger or not? It's the real criteria is consenting adults. Anyway, this is, I was, even granting so many things and it still wasn't making sense. I would have said that the level of physical affection I wanted to engage in was honest. What I desired was proportional to my interest in her. I would have had no problem following these chastity rules in the catechism if the reasons to back them up were relevant, but none of the reasons, those three they listed, seemed applicable to me or to my relationship at all at the time. One big piece of advice that I thought made sense previous to the situation was the idea of don't do anything that you would not feel comfortable telling your future spouse about. Well, as a single guy, this made sense. But in a relationship, I realized that this advice, when taken seriously, wouldn't mean dissolving anything romantic or sweet in the relationship that fostered our emotional bonds. And not spending romantic nights together or doing cute things together with my girlfriend just because it would not be pleasant for my future hypothetical spouse to hear it was absurd. Plus, how did I know that she was not my future spouse? If she was, then all of this effort being put into being chaste would be a huge waste of time. This was a problem that went unresolved for years and caused all kinds of emotional and psychological issues for me. Wow, I can't believe it. When it came down to it, the best I could do was no intercourse, no specific thoughts of intercourse, no pornography, and no masturbation. Anything else between us could technically be justified like venial sin. And if we were ever to actually get married someday in the future, so I guess that's the condition. Only if we were to get married in the future. That way I cover all my bases. So the fate of my soul was sort of contingent on whether or not we would actually end up getting married someday. If we did get married, my soul would be fine because it was my wife all along. If we broke up, then it would be both in a state of mortal sin. Oh, yeah, so see, because it caused arousal. And I'd have to go to confession immediately, because that time window, you don't want to die on the way to the confessional and get to hell for all eternity. It was a strange moral gray area that I did not understand at all, despite my best efforts, because I was stuck in the Catholic framework. One thing that was not a moral ambiguity for me was abortion, still. Since I was on the East Coast, I was able to do the pro-life march in the freezing cold of Washington, D.C. for 2 years in a row. Both times, I didn't get any sleep on the bus ride there or back. And each of these rallies, we listened to pro-life speakers lecture the crowd about why the pro-life side was right. Well, that was just stupid to me because we all already are pro-life. That was why we were there. Where were all the pro-choicers? For all the cold and suffering I endured and people around me praying rosaries, I didn't see this pro-life march actually helping the issue at all. Plus, the heavy mix of religion into the pro-life message was, to my eyes, doing more harm than good. It was obvious to me that you can't expose the evil of abortion to secular minds by preaching to them about Jesus over and over. It was a little frustrating, and after the second year, I didn't bother attending again. At the beginning of my second year at Franciscan, I was hit by a shocking and disturbing revelation that I found on the internet. I stumbled upon a conspiracy website, and they made the claim that the Twin Towers were brought down in a controlled demolition on 9/11. They had two comparison videos, one showing demolition squibs from a normal demolition, and one showing demolition squibs from the Twin Towers as they fell. I had never seen those squibs before on video, and I almost could not believe my eyes. Seeing those squibs come out of the towers was like seeing puppet strings on someone you thought was real for the first time. I was so shocked and taken aback, I spent the next couple weeks trying to disprove the theory. This conspiracy claim was so outrageous, I was sure it had already been debunked on the internet by now. But the more I learned about it, the more compelling the evidence supporting it became. Now, what did this have to do with my religion? Well, realizing that something like a 9/11 conspiracy could have happened right under my nose shook my reality and my worldview at its very foundation. If everyone, including myself, was wrong about 9/11, then it was very likely that I didn't know the first thing about anything, including religion. But my belief in God was way stronger than my belief in my particular religion or in the U.S. government. So after obsessing about the 9/11 conspiracy for too long, constantly watching internet documentaries, causing some problems in my family, I realized I needed to take a break from it and argue about something I knew was untouchable and I was correct in, and that was the existence of God. So I found an atheist forum called whywon'tgodhealamputees.com. I think that's more in reference to, like, the faith healers. They can heal pretty much anything except amputees. It's kind of a conspicuous absence. So that point just flew over my head when I joined this site. So I gave the people in this forum my very well thought out proofs for the existence of God and my version of the Trinity that, like, took out the names of Jesus and stuff and talked about those philosophical concepts of eternity, truth, and love. I was so convincing, not to toot my own horn, that I actually had one of them say to me, well, you didn't prove God exists. You only proved that an infinitely powerful and mysterious being exists and caused the universe. So I naively took that as a total win because that's what I thought I meant by God. But there were a few very important areas in my conversations with the atheists that I did not win. One was in the area of evolution. At the time, I was still an intelligent design proponent, same thing as creationism, sadly, and I didn't know the first thing about evolution. In my defense, no one really taught me properly. The best I ever got was a science teacher that just insisted it was true once. That was it. No explanations as to what it actually was. I always thought that evolution meant random molecules self-assembling to form living cells that somehow changed over millions of years to turn into people. I had no idea how wrong I was. It didn't help that in my arguing with them, I used an already thoroughly debunked and very cringe-worthy creationist source called the atheist test. I think that's from, what's his name? Ray Comfort, which espoused all the classic intelligent design arguments in one little pamphlet. The entire intelligent design philosophy can be summed up thusly. You can't have biological design without a designer, aka God. And then one of the atheists on the forum brought up an amazing counterpoint. What about snowflakes? They have a design, but no designer. That really got me because I knew how snowflakes form naturally without a designer. Yet, they had beautiful patterns. And they appeared to be designed. This was a huge wake-up call. And that snowflake was the beginning of the end of my Catholic faith. And they literally even had this banner as a joke that they just would post whenever they would own creationists. And I just felt Bender laughing at me here. I remember that particular day. It was the first time I considered atheism to be a legitimate possibility. And just the possibility, not even a certainty. And I was put in a state of shock. The consequences I believed followed from accepting atheism were dire. A universe of inanimate matter following laws of cause and effect. Nothing more. Everything and everyone I ever valued would actually just be meaningless patterns and shapes of matter. Even as I walked outside that day, the entire world and sky looked two-dimensional and empty. The emptiness was an infinitely deep and hollow emptiness that penetrated everything I saw, including myself, and the dusk sky above me. It was like the present moment wasn't even real, and I was reliving a mere faint memory that would ultimately just disappear at my death forever. I called my girlfriend to tell her about my doubts on God. She said that it would be terribly sad to find out God wasn't real. It would be like losing a good friend. I could not agree more. I had spent so much time and energy on making God the center and focus of my life that losing him would be a monumental tragedy for me emotionally. I would not know what to live for without God or what to even do with my life. Life without God was an infinitely pointless and empty life, or so I thought. Divine justice was an idea that helped me stay sane in the face of all the misery and injustice that occurred throughout the world and throughout history. To render all of that suffering both real and pointless would surely break me. The other areas where I did not win on this atheist forum were on the issues of morality and the Bible. At the time, I was convinced that without an afterlife, there was no logical reason or case for anyone to be moral at all. I mean, if you're just going to end, you might as well take what you can get while you're alive, because this is the only life you have. brought up the example of like a meteor about to strike Earth. If a meteor was going to strike Earth in 2 days, would you really bother paying your bills or respecting the traffic lights? Who cares? Stealing a Lamborghini would be the logical thing to do. It wouldn't matter if it was right or wrong at all. You'd actually get to enjoy the Lamborghini before you die. Well, they brought up an excellent counterpoint to this. They asked me, okay, if a meteor is going to strike Earth in 2 days, would torturing a puppy be okay? And I thought, well, no, absolutely not. Then I realized that even if there was no afterlife, torturing that puppy would still be an evil thing to do. That was another huge wake-up call. I had always thought that good and evil had to do with your relationship to God, and that the afterlife was the primary motivation to behave morally in this world. But once they brought up this counterpoint, I knew I was wrong about all of that. I had no idea what to believe at that point. The last nail in the coffin for me was what the atheists on the forum showed me about the Bible. For most of the conversation, I was able to explain that I didn't take the Bible literally. Rather, I listened to the church's interpretation of the Bible, since they were the ones that composed it. But then they showed me some verses in the Old Testament where Yahweh himself directly and explicitly told his people on earth that after they conquered a city, they could take the women as sex slaves to do with as they pleased. They also show me other instances of God endorsing not only slavery, but cruel treatment of slaves. I could not believe it. I told them I had no argument to defend these passages. I said that I have to research the church's teaching on these specific verses, and when I had a decent response, I would get back to them. They were happily surprised at my response. They're like, oh, wow, no one's ever even said that before. Great, we can't wait. And they told me to look forward to having me back. So the next time I visited the forum was years later, but that's much later on in the story. So back at Franciscan, I decided to take an intro to scripture class to hopefully answer my biblical questions. To my dismay, the entire class did everything it could to avoid reading the actual Bible. Instead, we read a book called History's Golden Thread, which only further emphasized the notion that the Bible only had stories of God's love in it, nothing evil, nothing contradictory. I brought up my concerns to the teacher. I told him I wanted to counter the atheists online who brought up the slavery verses in the Bible. My professor's response was, "There's no slavery in the Bible." At this point, I knew he was being intentionally dishonest with me. Despite the fact that he was dishonest about the slavery in the Bible, he was surprisingly honest about other aspects of the Bible that, in my mind, completely discredited it. He told us all of this information like it had no effect on the validity of the Bible. He explained how Genesis was actually based on the Epic of Gilgamesh, written hundreds of years before, from a different country, different theology, everything. It was like a total ripoff. He also explained that there was absolutely no physical evidence to back up the stories of Moses and the Egyptians at all. He even conceded that the story of Adam and Eve was not just partially metaphorical, but completely metaphorical. So I asked him a question during that particular class. I asked, if the story of Adam and Eve is a complete metaphor, then their eating from the tree of knowledge was a metaphor. If that's true, then how do we know that we actually inherited original sin if the very thing that caused it was just a metaphor? He responded, "Oh, that's a really great question. We'll get to that answer later on." Of course, we never did. There was another problem about the Adam and Eve story that I could not resolve. In order for the entire human race to originate from Adam and Eve alone, they and their children would have had to have incestual relations in order to make enough people to start the human population. However, the Catholic Church declared incest to be intrinsically evil, one of the many sexual mortal sins. If it was evil, why would God use it as a necessary means of creation? There's no way an evil thing could be good at one point in time and later evil later on, because that was moral relativism, the ultimate antithesis of Catholic moral teaching. We're scared of and hated moral relativists. Just before I was going to start my next semester in Austria, I watched a couple of important movies. The first was A Clockwork Orange. In that movie, the main character, Alex, was happy to do evil things. Then he was subjected to a traumatizing psychological experiment that created an artificial negative association to sex and violence in his mind. After that experiment, he was considered by the state to be a good person because now he felt sick at the mere sight of violence and was no longer able to do any more evil things like rape women, but only because it made him feel deathly sick. The question that I got from this movie was, is that all morality is? What actions make us feel sick and what actions make us feel good? After all, I said torturing the puppy was wrong because it made me feel sick. But if that's true, how is anyone different from Alex, the evil guy who, despite his treatment, is still clearly an evil person with only selfish motives? The other movie I watched was actually only the beginning of an online documentary called Zeitgeist. The first part included a comedy bit from George Carlin pointing out the absurdity of a loving God that had a special place to torture sinners forever, and despite his unlimited power to do things like create the universe, he still needed money in the form of church donations. Then it got really interesting, pointing out the startling similarities between Christ and other mythical gods that preceded him. In the screenshot, Horus in particular. While watching this, I had a very brief thought that maybe the true Son of God was one of those previous gods, like Horus. Maybe my philosophy on the Trinity actually pointed to Horus as the incarnation of the truth, and Jesus was just a copycat imposter. After all, I had heard about some freaky, unexplained supernatural curses associated with the excavation of King Tut's cave. I immediately did a quick Google search on Horus and found that almost all of the similarities stated in the documentary were grossly exaggerated. Once I found that out, I stopped watching the documentary and just decided to dismiss it outright. Before I left for my semester in Austria, I began to have a couple of nagging questions about original sin. I could see that the Virgin Mary was a case of a human that was preserved from the effects of having original sin. They called it the Immaculate Conception. But every other human that had ever lived was born with original sin and had to live their whole lives with its harmful effects, like ignorance, death, the inclination to sin, etc. But if God could preserve someone from original sin, and original sin was the cause of 99% of all the evil and suffering in the world, why the hell would he only preserve one person? What's stopping him from preserving all of our souls from it? I brought this up to my dad, and he said that the fact that Mary was free from original sin wasn't really a gift because it resulted in her suffering infinitely more. She, unlike us, who are relatively oblivious, could see how damaging sin really was. It's crazy because he was like my age at the time of having this conversation, and now so at the time, so I was like, I guess 20, and he was 38, so I'm 38 now. This did not satisfy me at all. I saw no reason why God would allow sin to spread needlessly in this way. It seemed completely preventable and therefore unnecessary. Nothing about it was worth keeping. Even if there was, it was not worth the risk of even one extra soul going to hell. It wasn't fair. Then I had a realization. Maybe there was no one in hell. Was this possible according to Catholic teaching? Yes. After all, God does take everything into account in his judgment. The Catholic Church was very specific about how someone could go to hell. Unlike Protestants and most other Christian denominations who think that anyone who happens to not hear Jesus' name is going to hell, we Catholics knew that this type of attitude was nonsense, not to mention contradictory to God's merciful nature. So unless someone filled the 3 criteria to commit a mortal sin, 1, it's actually a serious offense, 2, they committed it with full knowledge, and 3, they committed it with full consent of the will, and then died in a state of unforgiven mortal sin, then they have to have all that criteria to go to hell. So unless they filled them all, they would not go to hell. So technically only someone who is aware of this specific Catholic teaching could go to hell. And who would choose to commit a sin with full knowledge that would send them to hell? I would say none. I never had. And I didn't think I actually could. No one would if they really knew what they were choosing. To add to my conviction on this issue, I considered an eternity of hell to be completely disproportional punishment to any number of finite crimes on earth. I had already heard it argued that since God deserved infinite respect, disrespecting him would constitute an infinitely evil crime. But this did not work for me. For one, I remember reading a quote from C.S. Lewis that supported the idea that God was immutable and unaffectable. He said something like, "A man can no more diminish God's glory by refusing to worship him than a lunatic can put out the sun by scribbling the word darkness on the walls of his cell." I could not agree more. No sin or blasphemy against God could ever offend him, do harm, or affect his glory in any way. This was a concept that seemed lost on most Catholics I knew that got all uppity and defensive about blasphemy. On top of all this, I knew there was no way a finite creature could be infinitely culpable for their sin. The only way I could logically see it was in the case that after seeing God, the person still rejected him. But if God really was truth, goodness, and beauty infinitely manifest, then no sane person would choose hell over him. What about Satan, you ask? I had no answer to that. Yet, that question floated in my mind for quite some time. For punishment to be eternal was to render it a non-punishment. I mean, a just punishment was one that both prevented future crimes, through fear of punishment or through education. Oh, I'm going to teach that guy a lesson. And also, compensated the victim, restorative justice. For example, giving back money stolen. So in response to this, I heard that hell was not a punishment from God, but just an inevitable consequence of sin and not being in God's presence in the afterlife. In either case, hell was not just a just consequence. And I guess that's the end of this chapter. So more to come in chapter 5. Thanks for listening.